You're listening to The Secrets of Doctor Who, where we discuss everything about the hit BBC series, Doctor Who. And today we're discussing the 14th Doctor story, Liberation of the Daleks, and the Children in Need special for 2023. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today on the panel are Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
And Father Cory Sticha. Hey, Father Cory.
How's it going?
Very well, thanks. Folks, be sure to stick around to the end of the episode where we will have your listener feedback on some of our recent episodes that we've had. And also, I want to encourage you to follow The Secrets of Doctor Who in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, your favorite podcast app, or watch us on the StarQuest YouTube channel, where you should make sure to hit the bell to get notifications. And we're at youtube.com/StarQuestMedia. And finally, before we get started, I want to tell you about another show on the StarQuest Network you are sure to enjoy called The Secrets of Middle-earth. You can find that wherever fine podcasts are found or at sqpn.com/Middle-earth. All right. We are going to be discussing a 14th Doctor story, and we should probably, before we get into it, preface it by how can we be discussing the 14th Doctor story when the specials haven't even aired yet. Jimmy, I think you brought this one to my attention, right?
Yeah. So Doctor Who Magazine is a publication in England that carries Doctor Who comics, and it often has comic stories featuring the Doctor running between seasons of Doctor Who. So between Power of the Doctor, which is when Jodie Whittaker's Doctor regenerated into David Tennant's 14th Doctor, it's still been going on. And so just like they continue to have Patrick Troughton stories before in season 6B in the comic books before John Pertwee was cast, we have a 14th Doctor story here before the 14th Doctor makes it onto television. And this story is actually considered canonical because Russell T Davies supervised it. It takes place over the course of 1 hour of the Doctor's life. It's 14 parts long in the comics. And it leads up to the Children in Need special, which is the 14th Doctor's first appearance on television, other than the post-regeneration scene that we saw at the end of Power of the Doctor. So there's a sequence from Power of the Doctor to Liberation of the Daleks to the Children in Need special to the first of the 14th Doctor specials, The Star Beast.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, and this 14-part strip was started in like the December 2022 issue, and the last bit is in the December 2023 issue. Mm-hmm. Now, we're not going to be just discussing what was in the pages of the magazine, because an enterprising Doctor Who fan put together all of the comics in a very, very technically astute way on their YouTube channel, with music and no narration. You got to read it, but it's very well done. Like a lot of the modern, tablet comic strips.
It's a motion comic, so it's a comic that incorporates elements of motion.
Right. Yes, thank you. And it creates a sense of the drama that's in the story. So the medium is very, very interesting. And that was about an hour long. I think the video.
It was an hour and 16 minutes long.
Originally, he did each strip as they came out. So he had different, he had 13 or 14 part comic. So he did 14 different videos. And then when the last one was released, he just this last week packaged them all as one full story. Okay. And I found it flowed very well. I was kind of a little worried about, okay, you got to sit and read everything. But I found it to work very, very well. He did a good job of bringing up the text bubbles and everything as the story progressed. It wasn't static. It wasn't just like this scene, then this scene, then this scene. It was very static, and he did a good job, like you said, Dom, moving things around, making it, fluid. What I thought would have been kind of interesting is if he had then went and used some of the voice AIs to at least do the Doctor's voice and maybe the Daleks. I think that would have been kind of fun too, to have those voices added on, and maybe he will in the next version. Who knows?
Yeah.
It was impressive how he handled the cuts between stories, because in the final version, it's very seamless. You can kind of tell where some of the cuts between stories or breaks between stories occurred or breaks between chapters occurred, because it's like, okay, here, oh, this would make a good cliffhanger, wouldn't it? And oh, here's a little bit of a recap of the story so far. But other than that, it was very seamless.
So with that said, we should probably get into the discussion of the story itself. And Jimmy, can you give us a recap of what happens?
This week, immediately after the regeneration of the 13th Doctor, the 14th Doctor finds himself answering a distress call in the TARDIS. He emerges in what seems to be London in 1966, which was Britain's first winning of the World Cup. But he encounters aliens pretending to be humans, and while he's talking to them, a huge Dalek ship appears in the sky and begins an invasion. A woman named Georgie Gold gives the Doctor a World Cup soccer trophy, and he puts her in the TARDIS to keep her safe from the Dalek attack. It oddly turns out that the Doctor is immune to Dalek ray weapons, which he shouldn't be. He scans them and determines that the Daleks are all identical on the molecular level, which means that they aren't real Daleks. They're identical Xerox copies of some Dalek. But the Daleks insist that they are real and blow up the Earth to prove it. A couple of gorillas in spacesuits grab the Doctor and teleport him to safety, and a very confused Doctor then learns that he hasn't been on the real Earth in 1966. So, Earth didn't get blown up in the 60s. Instead, he's in the Dalek Dome, a futuristic amusement park that has domes representing different worlds and periods. Each dome has an adventure involving fake Daleks that tourists can participate in and enjoy. A high official in the Dalek Dome is a woman named Georgette Gold, and she's an identical copy of the Georgie Gold the Doctor met a few minutes earlier. Or rather, Georgie Gold is a copy of Georgette Gold. Georgie, like all the fake Daleks, is made of psychoplasm, a malleable substance that all the fantasy characters in the Dalek Dome are made of. The Doctor is horrified by there being a Dalek-themed amusement park, and he's even more horrified when he learns that the leaders of the fake Daleks are mentally tied to actual Dalek mutants that the park officials have in isolation tanks in the lower levels. And one of the actual Dalek mutants is waking up and becoming self-aware. However, the psychoplasm is only stable inside of the domes. And when the wakeful Dalek leader and his minions come out of a dome, the Doctor keeps them talking long enough for their psychoplasm bodies to destabilize and melt. Unfortunately, Georgie Gold sees this and realizes that she will melt also, so she goes to the Skaro dome and makes a deal with its Golden Emperor Dalek. She has footage of the Doctor saying it might be possible to stabilize her on the quantum level, and she proposes an alliance with the Daleks to get the Doctor to reveal how, so that all the psychoplasm life forms can become real and continue living outside the domes. That is the liberation of the Daleks from the title. To force the Doctor to reveal what he knows, the Daleks exploit a psychic link between Georgie Gold and Georgette Gold to hypnotize all of the park patrons. And the Daleks say they will begin executing them as hostages unless the Doctor reveals what he knows. The Doctor does end up revealing that it's possible to stabilize their psychoplasm forms, but the Daleks would need to create a massive reality gate to fly through to stabilize their molecules, and they'd have to have billions of genius mathematicians to do the calculations needed. The Golden Emperor isn't phased, and he has the system create a new moon for Skaro filled with billions of genius mathematicians. They do the calculations, and a reality gate begins to be constructed in orbit. But when Georgie Gold realizes that the Daleks only want to stabilize themselves and will let her and all the other psychoplasm forms die, she turns on them. She breaks the hypnotic link and frees all the hostages, and the Daleks shoot her dead for her act of betrayal. The Doctor reveals that there's another problem, which is that the Daleks will need more psychoplasm than they have available to finish the ships they need to fly through the reality gate, but the Gold Emperor says they will simply drain psychoplasm from the other domes in the complex. The Doctor then teleports between domes and starts a civil war among the Daleks by letting their leaders know what the Gold Emperor is planning. The Doctor then gets aboard the Gold Emperor's ship and crashes it into the mathematician moon, causing their calculations to stop. This ends the threat, but it leaves the Dalek mutants still slumbering in their tanks on the lower levels. Georgette asks the Doctor whether they should be allowed to live, and he tells her that now that she's seen what the Daleks are really like, not the sanitized version they showed to the tourists, she should make the decision. The end.
Wow, that was like a 14-part, invasion of the Daleks.
Yeah, I think it's the longest summary I've had to do thus far. They pack a lot into those 116 minutes.
Yeah. So overall impressions of the story, Father Cory?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, again, the format was very interesting because it was a comic, and watched the video of it, not read the comics. But it was a fun story. It really was. It was, some great callbacks, and getting to see the 14th Doctor in action. He picks right up where he left off when he regenerated into Matt Smith. So it was fun.
How about you, Jimmy?
Yeah, I enjoyed it also. I particularly liked the way they incorporated elements of earlier Doctor Who comics history, because early on, like in the 60s, there were a bunch of Dalek comics, and they did homages to that in the different Dalek domes. They're based on, at least in part, they're based on older Dalek comic stories, and you get to see Dalek craft vehicles that were designed for those stories being brought back now all these decades later, and they have some quite visually striking designs. The story is interesting. One of the things I didn't mention in the summary, I did mention that the Doctor is teleported away by two gorillas in spacesuits, and I didn't really explain that. The park officials, some of them are human, like Georgette Gold, but others are former park workers, because apparently this used to be like a nature preserve. And before it was the Dalek Dome, and so to help business, some of the staff had species plasties where they were reshaped to look like members of other species. So like the chief is a lion, a couple of the park workers are gorillas, they have park workers who are other like human versions of other animals. They look like the animals, but they have human minds. And they're really humans, but they've been surgically altered to look like animals. One thing that is interesting is, this is a comic book, and it's a tradition in comics to sneak Easter eggs into the background. That started in comics before it started in animation. And so if you look carefully, you will, among others, in the background, see park patrons Kirk and Spock.
I saw that. I did see them. I was going to bring that up. Yep, they're in there. I didn't see others, but there's probably others in there. So for me, I mean, I felt like this was it's a cross between Jurassic Park, Westworld, and a TNG holodeck episode. When the holodeck goes wrong, it really had that feel of you've created this thing and it's out of control. You've tried to turn this dangerous thing into an amusement, and that's a classic trope of science fiction. Again, Jurassic Park and Westworld both made those stories. So it was good. I like it. Just to let people know, I should have said this off the top. We'll have links to the video, of course, in the show notes on our website. But I thought it was an interesting way to enjoy a Doctor Who story. I never really had seen the Doctor Who comics before, and I felt like I could see the voice of David Tennant as the 14th Doctor in it. It came across as true to the character, so that was a lot of fun too. Yeah,
they patterned the dialogue after how David Tennant's 10th Doctor was written.
Yeah,
like he's got one line later on where he's saying goodbye to the Dalek Emperor at the end, when the Emperor has been defeated, and he says, "See you later, exterminator."
Yeah, right.
there were times where I could hear in the back of my mind David Tennant saying the lines. I mean, they did a good job of that. They really did.
Yeah.
Now, just kind of a quick question, Jimmy. Do you know if they've got any of the comics in collections that are available?
Yes. Yeah. There are various trade paperback collections and electronic paperback collections, like Kindle editions, of various Doctor Who comics. I've read the Doctor Who comics going back as far as the 1980s, off and on, because I don't have access here in America. regular access. But there is going to be a trade paperback and I assume a Kindle edition of these 14. It's just not out yet. It should be out in a month or two or something.
Well, it'd be
Cool.
fun too to go see how far back you could go. If you go back to the original ones that they've done for like the first or second Doctors, or
I know some of those are available online. In fact, when we did the War Games, or it may have been Spearhead from Space, I put together a collection of the second Doctor stories between the War Games and Spearhead in Space, and we put a link to it so listeners could read them for themselves,
Right.
and see how they explained the Doctor's regeneration that didn't happen on screen.
right.
That's true. I found it interesting. This was obviously intended for a British audience, so there's lots of talk in that first part about that World Cup game, references to players and events in the game, and things that British soccer fans or football fans would probably know off the top of their head. They'd recognize it all. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, I have two things working against me here. One, I'm an American, and two, I don't know anything about sports ball. So so this was a whole other world to me. I had in the story when Georgie gives the Doctor this World Cup trophy. I mean, it's just like she's giving him this golden object. What is this? And he refers to it repeatedly as the Jules Rimet. And I'm like, okay, so what's a Jules Rimet? I had to look it up. It's the World Cup soccer trophy.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'd recognized it as the trophy, but I didn't know that was the name of it. So that's a learning for me. I'm learning more about soccer / international football. I didn't know that was the name of it, but I'd recognized it when she handed it to him.
Everything I know about British football, I learned at Ted Lasso. So no, I'm just kidding. I used to live with a buddy of mine who years ago was a big Premier League fan, and so I learned plenty about it then. Did you know there's a Bettinelli who plays in British football? Just thought I'd mention that. Marcus. I think he plays for Chelsea. Just mentioning.
I was kind of surprised that 1966 was the first British victory in the World Cup. But of course, I didn't know how far back the World Cup goes. Turns out it was apparently first played in 1930, so it took the British 36 years to win it.
I think the first time they had the World Cup in Britain.
Yeah, at Wembley, which is interesting. So back to the Doctor. I found it interesting that the Daleks have apparently learned not to let the Doctor keep talking. I thought that was an interesting point they make in there. If he keeps talking, he's probably going to make us, crazy or do something to us. I thought that was fun.
He's either going to talk himself into his plan, or he's going to talk to distract them until his plan gets put into effect. Either way, it's not good for the Daleks.
Right. And then you have this time tourist family of aliens who have been. So at first, I thought before we knew we were in the Dalek Dome, I thought, oh, these must be aliens visiting Earth from the future, but instead they're just park attendees. Like they got a family pass to Disney World, and
they're not really time tourists because the domes are all really in the same time.
Right. The Doctor calls them time tourists, I think, at first, and that got stuck in my head. But they're just tourists, in this amusement park ride, which is essentially, and they have they have like social media that they keep posting to from their selfies, which was kind of a fun little distraction.
Future Instagram.
Yeah, and they look or Twitter. And they look happy, and as the Daleks are blowing stuff up in the background in their photos, so it's weird. And at first it seems way more sinister than it is, because at first we don't know this is an amusement park. It looks like these are aliens reveling in scenes of Dalek destruction on Earth with people being killed. The specific social media platform is TelePix with a bunch of X's, and I like how they have recognizable but alien components to it. So you got the picture of the family, in some Dalek scene, and then at the bottom of the picture you've got show-agains, which would be the equivalent of retweets. How many people have retweeted this or shown it again. And then you've got lurvits, which is slang for love it. So that's a like.
Right. I also like how Tell E Picks might be a little bit of an Easter egg reference to Telly Snaps, which was, the thing we had for so many years of classic Who stories.
And some of it is actually like and the Doctor even calls it out, like when you're going on a ride, a theme park ride where you can get the picture as you're going down. You're screaming as you're going down the log flume or something like that. I got a kick out of the family too, because it was a typical family. You had the parents, you had the teenage girl that was always on her phone or a scroll in King Arthur's court.
Yes.
And the boy who was excited, but he was getting bored, and just kind of a stereotypical family. It was great.
So this idea of the Dalek fun zone, like having an amusement park that's full of, Daleks exterminating people. What is the morality or ethics of that sort of thing? I mean, it seems like it's in bad taste.
Well, okay. I think it's a matter of time, as time increases, we don't have to take things as seriously as we would if we were really there. Mm-hmm. So, today we could have amusement parks that have, Roman scenes or,
Viking
raids or things like that. But I thought as a comparison, because the Daleks are basically space Nazis. Mm-hmm. Today, this would be like having a Nazi theme park. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's distasteful.
That would be.
But in 2,000 years, with 2,000 years of distance, okay, a lot of people looked at the Romans like we look at the Nazis. A lot of people looked at the Vikings like we look at the Nazis. So you have enough distance and you don't have to take things as seriously because it's no longer a threat in active historical memory. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to judge things more gently with more distance.
Well, and the other thing too is these are, at least in the Who canon, fictional events, because this wasn't the Dalek invasion of 2150. This was the Dalek invasion of 1966, which in the Doctor Who universe didn't happen. And the Doctor says, your fictional characters based on, children's books. These events didn't happen in the real world, in the real canon of Doctor Who. So there's that aspect too. This is the Hogan's Heroes version of the Daleks, is what this is. So it's a fictional event based on real bad guys.
Right. I like that analogy, Father Cory, and the Doctor is kind of being a shrill Karen. It's like if someone said, "Oh, Hogan's Heroes, you could never make fun of World War II, camp life." It's like, well, yeah, you can, and Hogan's Heroes did it brilliantly.
Yeah, it's a great show.
So yes, it's one of the best. This actually came up on our Discord, this discussion of video game violence, and is it immoral to kill people in video games? And one of the things I could see someone saying is, okay, yeah, I mean, you could go visit, and there could be, if it's playful, Romans or Vikings or whatever, but this is showing, Daleks murdering people by the boatload. That seems wrong. I don't know. I mean, I guess I would compare it to an immersive video game. You're in the video game. You're seeing, you say it's, Call of Duty and you're shooting people. But I don't think, I personally, I don't think that's anything immoral about, play acting at shooting things, people.
Not in principle, but I think it can have a morally deleterious effect on people. So if you're doing Call of Duty, if I understand that game correctly, you're playing like an American serviceman who is trying to do good in the world, and he's required to shoot people as part of his job. And so that's okay. That's moral. If you're using lethal force because you have to, and if you're using lethal force to accomplish good, okay, that's fine. That's virtuous. But if you're playing Grand Theft Auto and you're a drug dealer who's shooting people for fun, well, okay, that application of lethal force would not be licit in the real world, and play acting that part for fun would be much more morally dicey.
Right.
Okay. All right. I'd see that.
Also, if it's cartoony, like if you're in Super Mario Brothers Death Zone and you're shooting people with mushrooms and they just pop, you know, okay, that's a different thing too.
That's true.
Well, and the question for this too is this more like watching a show? You know, like if someone made an immersive movie,
right?
You know, like a VR movie or something like that of the Daleks killing people, because that's more what this is.
Because they're not Daleks
in there are observers, and there's some of them too where like they show the King Arthur's court where the family is actively fighting the Daleks.
Right. That's true.
So I mean, so that's kind of more of that kind of question too. Of is this more like a video game or is this more like, again, an immersive movie? You know, someone made an immersive movie where you're a German citizen watching the wars of World War, the battles of World War II. That's closer to what this is.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I could go with that. So, some other notes on what happens in it. I noticed that the first Doctor's brain machine shows up in this. I forget exactly where it was. It was closer to the end than to the beginning. But that machine where it
was like a supercomputer.
Yeah, it was like the first Doctor's supercomputer. That was a nice little Easter egg in there. Also, I note that the Doctor jumps through a whole bunch of scenes of places where he's encountered the Daleks before in various stories. So that was a nice little Easter egg too. So those were pretty fun. So any other things you guys want to bring up about that you noticed in this story? You want to mention?
Well, one thing to mention is the psychoplasm is the flesh from Rebel Flesh. It is the same stuff.
Oh,
and that's the whole issue of Georgie remembering the times that she's gone through these stories,
right?
Where she was in 1966 and she was at the fire of London in 1666 and so on, where she remembers all them because the Rebel Flesh remembers.
That was an 11th Doctor story, right?
So that all the psychoplasm, but it's different where
they don't call it flesh.
Yeah.
But
they actually the Doctor says something about evil, the Daleks made flesh or whatever, or memories made flesh or whatever it is, but he uses that word flesh, and it's a purpose. I'm not sure that was a purpose callback to this story. Now the difference is in Rebel Flesh they could exist in the real world, and I don't think they ever really explained that there was anything kind of holding them together. It's just once they were established, they stuck. But in this, they could not stay outside of the domes.
Yeah.
Right.
It's very holodecky.
Yeah.
And then, right.
Actually, I kind of got a chuckle when you had that little Freudian slip in the summary. Holodeck, I mean,
yeah.
Dome.
Yes.
That was more of a Freudian plant than a staff.
Yeah. Very cool. Anything else?
Well, I'm kind of glad, and I hope it doesn't come back. The 13th Doctor's sonic screwdriver gets blasted.
Yay!
Twice.
I hated that screwdriver.
I hope it doesn't come back. I hope they give him a nice one.
Yes, I agree. All right, and Jimmy, how about you? Any other thoughts?
So I like that at one point a girl is blasting a Dalek with anti-Dalek fluid, and it's just a water pistol.
Yes.
It's the water is anti-Dalek fluid. There's a nice bit where the Daleks are talking to the Doctor about does he have the right to do X, Y, or Z, and the Doctor says, "Oh, you want a moral debate? Great. Call the Archbishop of Canterbury. Let's get a discussion going."
That was good.
and I also like at the end. So when the Daleks have hypnotized people through Georgie and Georgette, they respond just like the Daleks do. The Daleks will give an order. They say, "I obey." And then when Georgie realizes that the Daleks are not going to liberate all of the psychoplasm life forms, just themselves, and then they want to take over the universe, she breaks the hypno link and shouts, "I disobey." Yeah. And it's not in context after seeing so many "I obeys," "I disobey" is very meaningful, and her death is a meaningful sacrifice, and it's actually touching. She says even though she's an artificial life form who didn't exist before however long ago, She says, I guess this time my life actually counted for something.
Yep.
Oh,
Very nice.
I forgot one thing. There's 2 song references in here. There's Hey There, Georgie Girl, which comes from Georgie Girl. And then there's it's the 2 gorillas are saying, it's raining Daleks, hallelujah. And then it's raining men.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember hearing that one. Yeah. The doctor also says, why are they attacking a soccer game? No, there isn't a soccer game in history that could have changed history, except Christmas 1914, which is referencing the famous event on that Christmas Eve when the British and German soldiers left their trenches and sang Christmas carols and played soccer on the no man's land.
Which the 1st and the 12th Doctor were at.
Yes, we saw that in Twice Upon a Time, right? Twice Upon a Time?
Yep.
So I got it one right. I remembered it. All right. Anything else we want to say about this story?
Nope.
Okay, so let's move on to the Children in Need special, which I don't think had a title, but just Children in Need special.
It'll have one eventually.
Yes. And this is a 2023 special. They do these every year, right? Do the Children in Need charity special?
They do a Children in Need charity special. There's not always a Doctor Who component.
Right. And it's a fundraising sort of telethon thing, and a lot of British TV shows will produce a special story or segment or something for it. Those of us who are older Americans, the Gen X age and older, may remember the Jerry Lewis telethon, which was
the March of Dimes telethon.
Yep.
Another one. Yeah. So
in Britain, they also used to, I don't know if they still do it, the Red Nose special, where that was more comedic. And that's where we get the Curse of the Fatal Death.
Right. That was from the Red Nose specials. Right. So, Jimmy, could you give us a recap of this brief story?
This is a 5-minute sketch. It starts with the TARDIS zooming towards planet Skaro, which is actually anticipated. It's hinted at the end of the comic story that the Doctor's next destination may be Skaro. And here we see it is. The TARDIS hurtles towards Skaro. We get an orienting shot in a Khaled bunker or lab of some kind. Davros, he's not a young man, but he's not in the wheelchair yet. He doesn't have the third eye yet. He's standing up upright, is receiving a new aid who's very subservient. And they're looking at a Mark III travel case Dalek, although it doesn't have a name Dalek yet. The new assistant is proposing that since our race are called the Khaleds, maybe our future selves should be an anagram of that, like Ladek. And Davros is like, no. And he names like 4 or 5 different anagrams of Khaled, and Davros shoots them all down. Davros is then called away for a minute, and while he's out, the TARDIS crashes into the lab and snaps off the multi-armed tool that the Dalek is equipped with. The 14th Doctor then gets out and is shocked and says, "That's a Dalek." And the assistant says, "Ooh, good name," and he writes it down. and the Doctor says, what are you going to do? The assistant says, well, you broke this arm. And the Doctor's like, what are you going to do? Exterminate me? Oh, exterminate. And he writes that down. And the Dalek's putting it together and says, wait, is this the genesis of the Daleks? And the assistant says, ooh, this is gold. And he writes that down. And the doctor's about to leave and is saying, look, I was never here. But the guy says, what about the multi-arm tool you snapped off? And the Doctor says, oh, hang on a second. He reaches inside the TARDIS, pulls out a plumber's helper, a plunger, gives it to the guy, and then gets in the TARDIS and makes a shushing sound, meaning I was never here, and leaves. And then Davros comes back into the room. The assistant has attached the plunger to the Dalek. Davros looks at it and says, I like it. The end.
Yeah. So, this is a very brief story, so we probably won't have a lot to say about it. But I have to, before we get into anything, I did write down all the different names he came up with. It was Lekhad, Adlek, Clayed, and Elka. It's just the delivery was so good. I had to laugh at all of those. It was very good. Father Gray, what did you think of this little story?
This was fun. This was just so much fun. Yeah, it was short, but it was just goofy, kind of campy fun. It was good to see Davros before his accident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you know, it was good to see. We'd heard about the Mark III travel machine. That was, I believe, that was the name that Davros used at Genesis of the Daleks, original Tom Baker story.
I think they may have elevated it to Mark IV. This may be one before the one we saw in Genesis of the Daleks.
So that goes back to that. There's a lot of little callbacks. You know, we'll get into that here in a second. But yeah, I enjoyed it.
And Jimmy, how'd you enjoy this one?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was harmless fluff, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was our first live action view of the 14th Doctor in action, apart from that one regeneration scene. Not a lot of
what?
Guess what? Not a lot of regeneration madness, I would say, in this one. Maybe we're going to avoid some of that because we've got to get right into those 60th anniversary specials.
He did mention an hour ago I was a brilliant woman, and now I've got this same face again. And that's on-screen confirmation for what Russell T Davies has said off-screen, which is liberation of the Daleks takes an hour.
Yeah.
So it's basically real time.
And that's also a callback to the regeneration of the 13th Doctor, where she's in the train. She's crashed into the train. She goes, half an hour ago, I was a white-haired Scotsman.
Yeah, right. That was, so the new Davros, or the new old Davros, so he doesn't look like the Davros we'd been most recently seeing. He's not in the mobile Dalek half and no scars and all that sort of thing. Bring it up. I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time on it, but Russell T Davies.
Oh, I wanted to talk about this.
Okay, he makes a big deal out of this.
Yeah,
but
I watched it not knowing about Russell T Davies' comments on Davros. I just watched it and I thought, oh, great, this is Davros before he has his horrible accident. And I was happy to see him that way. It's a nice. We've seen other phases of his life. We've seen him as a child. Most of the time we've seen him after his accident. Here we see him before his accident, but he's clearly an old man here. And I thought it was fine. I enjoyed it. But then Russell T Davies has to go and say, oh, this was a deliberate choice because Davros is a wheelchair user in his classic depiction. And we're not judging any of the people who used to depict him that way, but it's so hurtful to depict disability in connection with evil. And so this is how we are imagining Davros now. And I'm going, dude, you're limiting your storytelling. Because there's only so much you can do with Davros before the Daleks, you know.
Yeah.
And unless you're basically cutting the Daleks out of the story, if you're limiting the stories you can tell. If you say this is who Davros is now, it's also just ridiculous. I would have sympathy if like every or bunches of classic Doctor Who villains were wheelchair users. You know how many are? One.
Right.
That's not establishing some kind of strong, sinister pattern.
I was actually kind of hoping we wouldn't talk about it, but we're there. It's interesting because in the interview that, it's like a minute and a half of a longer interview with Russell T Davies where he talks about this. And all the comments on YouTube are like, I'm a wheelchair user, and this is actually kind of offensive what you just said.
Yeah.
They're actually like, we can have villains be wheelchair users, just as we can have good people be wheelchair users. Patrick Stewart in X-Men, the original X-Men movie, was a wheelchair user. Professor X, he's a good guy. Okay, we've got both. I mean, you can go through. So I'm just going to say those are Russell T Davies' opinion. Canon is this is Davros before the accident.
Yeah,
that's how I'm leaving it.
and it is clearly Davros before the accident. Russell T Davies' opinions. I'm glad to see he got pushback from wheelchair users because it's ridiculous to say you can't ever have a villain that uses a wheelchair. I mean, sure, if you had bunches of villains as wheelchair users, that would set up a negative stereotype, but there ain't one. When I think wheelchair user, I don't think, oh, that person must be a hero or, oh, that person must be a villain. I think, oh, that person is using a wheelchair. So what?
Right. Right. I think it's a little patronizing on the behalf of Russell T Davies to kind of to say that, to make that his reason. Yeah. And I'm afraid that he's not even, it's going to be, well, prediction, perhaps. I don't think he's just going to limit himself to Davos before the accident. I think this is, if he has to bring in Davos for any story, they're just going to retcon it and just have him be a not confined to a mobile device, which I think it would be worse. And frankly, I never thought of it as a wheelchair. He was like he was half Dalek in a sense, and I think that was the idea that was being conveyed. So, all right. So,
one more thing about Davos. This is a more interesting thing. The actor who played Davos in this has played Davos throughout New Who.
It's the same actor
that's been in the mobile Dalek life support device,
travel device. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So we're going back to basically the genesis of the Daleks, which was a Fourth Doctor story. Although this is slightly after, I think, in the timeline.
Slightly before.
Oh, is it? Okay. Oh, yep. Right. Because when he goes to season,
that's where the assistant also wrote down Genesis of the Daleks.
Yes. So what we're getting in this little story is the Doctor is basically responsible for much of what we know of the most significant factors of the Daleks. He gave them their name, and he gave them the plunger, which everyone points out as a weird appendage for a death machine.
And exterminate.
And he gave them exterminate, and he gave this era of their history the name Genesis of the Daleks.
Right. I think it's funny that multifunction arm was so much better. Like as if you were to design a Dalek today, that's what you would have instead of the plunger, which some prop guy at the BBC's like, we need something else on this side. Kaplunk, give him a plunger.
There's also another thing, since we did comics this episode, if you look in some of the Dalek vehicles, they're basically floating hover platforms that an individual Dalek can get on and fly around. And that overcomes in the 1960s the limitation of they couldn't show Daleks flying on the screen in the 60s. But in the comics, they could give a Dalek a hover car that they could pilot around. And so they could have three-dimensional verticality threat. You couldn't just climb a ladder to get away from them.
Right. One interesting thing that has come up that Russell T Davies has said, speaking of, it's kind of related to this, is that we're not going to see Daleks or Cybermen in the 15th Doctor's season. He's going to do basically what Chibnall did with the 13th Doctor's first season, which was give them a rest and then come back to them later. So
good. I think that makes sense. Yeah. I have no burning need to see Daleks or Cybermen.
Right.
There are only so many stories you can tell with them. I like to see them once in a while, but not often.
Apparently the license for the Daleks has changed, so they don't have to have it every year now.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even with the 13th Doctor, I felt like we should have stuck with the fewer Daleks and Cybermen. In the end, we ended up getting a lot more of them, but that's that. Any other thoughts on this Children in Need special?
Nope. Enjoyed it. It was fun.
Yep, a lot of fun. All right, let's move on to our feedback that I promised. Our first feedback comes from our episode where we discuss the Face the Raven, the 12th Doctor story. Mark Romer on Facebook writes, in Torchwood, retcon was the name of an oral drug that the Torchwood team would give to someone to erase his recent memories. So that's where the reference in this story comes from. So,
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I never watched Torchwood, but I'm familiar with where the term originally comes from, which is comic books, where it stands for retroactive continuity, and Torchwood picked it up from there. Yeah,
it's clear Torchwood is getting it from that, and then Doctor Who's getting it as the drug form from there. Kathy Romer on Facebook writes, hi, Dom, Jimmy, and Father Cory. I had a sort of crossover comment from the Mysterious World podcast, Theoryland, having to do with the Trap Street. While I realize that this is not the plot point of this Doctor Who episode, I got to thinking about trap streets and tulpas. What are your thoughts, plausibility-wise, assuming that tulpas are a thing, about a show where someone saw a trap street on a map and believed it into existence? I'm guessing there'd have to be some major stressor to induce a person to believe that the street needed to be there. And anyway, this is the sort of stuff that my brain conjures up while listening to your podcast. Thank you for all you do. So, Jimmy, what do you think?
So tulpas are a kind of entity that is reported in theosophy and originally in like Tibetan Buddhism and things like that. And it's basically a thought form. The idea is that you use your own thoughts to create this mental entity that can even take on a life of its own. And so that's what a tulpa is. I don't know if tulpas are a real thing. Unfortunately, we don't have any tulpas that we can bring into the lab and study in parapsychology. So these are anecdotal reports. Assuming tulpas are a real thing, I guess you could have someone mentally conjure up the thought form of a trap street, and it might even take on a life of its own. Which reminds me of a character in DC Comics. There is in the Doom Patrol, which is about a group of really weird heroes. One of the and it's a really weird comic. There is a character named Danny the Street, and Danny is a street. He's an intelligent street. So if you created a thought form of a street, it might very well be intelligent like Danny. And so I don't know Danny's origin. I don't know if he was originally a normal street that then became intelligent, but I'd have to check that out. Maybe there's some connectivity there.
That's funny.
I was thinking of puns, but no. So our next comment comes from our discussion of the episode Talons of Wing Chiang. Matthew Slavin on YouTube writes, in the late 1990s, I had an opportunity to speak face-to-face with the director, David Maloney, and his wife, Edwina. I was very pleased since he had directed some enjoyable Doctor Who stories, Talons being my favorite. The Maloneys were warm and friendly. David seemed to genuinely enjoy discussing his work and Doctor Who in particular. Others were also engaged. Unfortunately, an immature questioner asked why the actor John Bennett had been chosen to play the character of Li Sen Chang instead of a Chinese actor. David was clearly disappointed, but patient with the criticism of his choice. He thought that Bennett was such a blessing for the show, his words, and so excellent an actor in the role that he couldn't have imagined another portraying the character as well. Almost as an aside, he mentioned they had sought out Asian actors at the time, but of those interviewed, none had the acting chops for such an important part, some ending up in smaller roles. I believe David mentioned the British actor Burt Kwok may have been up for the part, but that he was unavailable at the time.
That's too bad because Burt Kwok would be good, but the actor who they ended up casting was really good.
Yes. I agree with David on his choice of Bennett and also with Jimmy's comment about the multidimensionality of Chang's character. On a side note, our children have always enjoyed this episode, and for a time, viewing it together was something of an event in our family. I may have to kickstart that tradition again this weekend. Thanks for the episode and the memories. Cheers. So,
thank you.
That's awesome. That's a great anecdote. Getting to see and talk to the people who make these stories is a great opportunity, and it's really cool that you got that.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, people think of going to see like a Comic-Con and meeting the actors, but getting to talk to the people who wrote it or produced it or made the decisions for it is incredible. I mean that in itself could be story after story of everything that went into it. And and then I could see where somebody like a producer is like, oh yeah, I made this story, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
I'd much rather talk to writers and directors than actors. I mean, I might like to meet an actor and get their autograph, but if you ever listen to commentary tracks on DVDs, if you listen to the writer's director producer commentary, it's way more interesting than the actor commentary.
Yeah.
The actor commentary is like, oh yeah, I remember this scene. We did this with the cameras. Yeah.
yeah. I've heard some of those like that.
Galaxy Quest kind of calls that out, a little bit, where the actors in there are kind of like, yeah, we just did our part.
I stood on my mark and I said my line.
Yep.
Ian Haygreen on YouTube writes, Robert Holmes was an officer in the British Army in Burma during World War II. Perhaps he came across the Golden Bridge out there.
Maybe
the concept.
That's interesting. He might have.
Yep. And then Jason Thayer on YouTube writes, Leela.
We should explain that. In for people who don't remember, in some Asian near-death experiences, it's reported that people, instead of perceiving moving through a tunnel to the afterlife, they perceive crossing a bridge to the afterlife. So that's right. And they had Lee Sin Chang having that, like, I'm crossing the Golden Bridge now. Mm-hmm. And we were wondering, wow, I mean, near-death experiences were barely known in the West when this serial came out. How would Robert Holmes have known about the Golden Bridge, or did he, or is he just making this up? And so that's what that letter's about. It's explaining how he might have known about it.
Right. And then Jason Thayer commented on YouTube that Leela on Futurama, the comic, the animated show, is named after Leela from Doctor Who. So that's good to know. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your feedback. We really do appreciate getting it. And we'd like to take a moment now to thank our patrons who make it possible for us to create the Secrets of Doctor Who, including Kevin B., Joseph D., Ben and Autumn B., Catherine M., and Timothy P. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue the Secrets of Doctor Who and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. So that's it from us. We'd love to know what you thought of the 14th Doctor stories, Liberation of the Daleks, and the Children in Need special, which you can watch after you've finished the show by going to our show notes on our website. You can let us know what you think about it by commenting at sqpn.com or the Secrets of Doctor Who Facebook page. Send an email to drwho@sqpn.com or visit the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord. And as I mentioned, you can watch the Secrets of Doctor Who on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/StarQuestMedia. We'll be back next week when we'll be discussing, that's right, folks, the first of the 60th anniversary specials, The Star Beast. And until then, Father Cory Sticha, thank you for joining me and sharing the Secrets of Doctor Who.
Well, thank you, Don. One quick thing, I was doing some research. The 2023 Children in Need special is also known as Destination Star.
Very good, thank you. And Jimmy Akin, thank you as well.
Thank you.
And once again, I'm Don Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to the Secrets of Doctor Who on StarQuest. Remember, it's raining Daleks. Hallelujah.